Hello, people of Earth, and hello, Murray Griffin. How are you doing?
Hello, Francisca Curran. Good, thanks, very good. And a very big week, of course, Francisca, this week. And I'm not referring to Eurovision.
Holistically, it's been a big week. Holistically, but I suspect you're alluding to possibly, I'm assuming, the budget.
Yes, indeed.
I'm
The
take a
federal
guess.
budget. Yes, absolutely.
The federal budget.
And we're going to talk about the budget, and we're going to talk about it without mentioning negative gearing at all, Francisca.
Oh, you've already done it. You've already done it.
Because we don't need to talk about that, do we, from our point of view?
No, we are interested in many other dimensions.
Exactly.
Yes.
There's no threatened species out there that are sort of getting ill-gotten gains from a second nest or property that they own.
So was the budget your pick of the week?
So there was something in the budget that was my pick of the week. I wanted to give a shout out to environment groups, particularly the Invasive Species Council, which successfully lobbied to retain funding for Australia's Saving Native Species Fund in the latest budget, because it wasn't a given that the program would continue, and it was due to expire at the end of next month. But it ended up with an additional 2-year allocation that totals almost $100 million. That money is really important because it supports practical on-ground conservation, things like feral deer control in World Heritage areas and yellow crazy ant eradication in Queensland. We don't want those yellow crazy ants anywhere in Australia.
No, we don't.
And feral cat eradication on Kangaroo Island and in other places. So it's great to see that program continue for at least another 2 years. And I think it just goes to show what environment groups can achieve, because there was, a lot of extensive lobbying on their part. So if you've been thinking of joining an environment group or supporting one with a donation, this is the kind of results that shows that being part of an environment group can definitely be worthwhile. So that was mine. What was your pick of the week, Francisca?
That is a lovely one, Murray. I do like that. I will also be Googling the crazy yellow ant just to, be able to
just to take it in.
Just to take it in. But my pick is also a shout out, and it's a shout out to Tony Maha, who is the Australian government's Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, who earlier this year, not that long ago, put out the annual report to the Australian Parliament from the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, which was recently put up on their website. And so in Tony's role as the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, what his objective is to make sure that regional Australians are treated fairly when large clean energy projects are built in these areas. And so every year they put out a report, and it always makes for interesting reading. And that was my rabbit hole of going down earlier today when I saw it in the newsletter. They contain statistics on complaints and some of the information on how the commissioner is approaching the role. And what I really liked about it was how authentic and genuine Commissioner Maha sounds in his quotes and in the way that he describes the challenges of clean energy deployment. He says things like it's more complex and deeper than he'd ever imagined, and that it, inevitably involves huge disruptions. And he outlines this in a sort of what sounds like a really genuine and dedicated way. One other quote is that he says, "My agenda and intentions remain clear: to do what I can within my remit to improve the experience of the energy transition for regional communities." So while the report is an interesting read, it's also really, inspiring to see someone that is so dedicated and caring.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some interesting statistics in there as well.
Yeah, that's right. So the report said that in 2025, the Commissioner opened 205 new cases, which included 170 complaints, which were related to about 78 projects. And it details a bit of the engagement around these. And about 90% of the cases were for projects in New South Wales and Victoria, and 50% of them were for wind farms. So you can have a deep dive, if you so wish, into that annual report to the Australian Parliament.
Yes, there's some interesting material in there. And so that post of what's now called the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner was actually created by Greg Hunt, a Coalition Environment Minister, back in about 2014. And Greg Hunt, he was a very clever politician, and for anything complicated, he tended to create a commissioner post, and then you could just leave it to them to sort it out.
It's them to sort out.
Yeah, so
and this is a challenge, isn't this? This is
absolutely,
a big remit.
yeah. And this role was first just originally it was just targeting wind farms, and it's gradually expanded over time to include solar farms and transmission infrastructure. And he does mention in that report that he's actually started getting complaints about waste to energy projects, which are not in his remit, certainly.
Maybe further expand the remit in the future.
Maybe.
We'll see.
The other commissioner, I think Greg Hunt also created a commissioner for feral cats. I think so. Or maybe it was a threatened...
pretty niche.
Or maybe it was...
I'll fact check that. I'm pretty sure it was a threatened...
No, maybe it was the threatened species commissioner. And that job was to come up... One of the key things in that role was to come up with ways to get rid of feral cats. Once again, he sort of hived it off.
That's the true story. It's the threatened species commissioner, not the feral cat.
Not the feral cat commissioner. But in fact, that was the first gig of the threatened species commissioner. And it always struck me as a very clever political solution. Oh, this problem's really hard. I'm going to create a commissioner and they can deal with it.
A political solution, but also maybe a practical solution.
Yeah, a good solution. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay,
great.
So
that was mine for the week.
Yes, and that's a really good one as well, and a great shout out to the Commissioner. Let's get stuck into the budget.
Let's get into the budget. Mm-hmm.
Yes. The budget represents the government's sort of vision and plan for the next 12 months, or in fact for the next 3 years, really, because it does project, 3 years outwards. And one difference this year is that there's a lot of money to bed down the reforms that were made last year to Australia's main environment law, which is called the EPBC Act. And importantly, those reforms include the creation of a National Environment Protection Agency, which once again, environment groups have been campaigning for a very long time, as that's great to see that get up and running. And in this budget, there's actually $500 million to bed down those EPBC reforms. Now, that's all really good, and that money has generally been welcomed by everybody because the EPBC Act is a really important law that's designed to protect and conserve Australia's native plants and animals. But
I knew there was a but, Murray.
There is indeed.
Is this a budget win for the environment? Are you labelling this as a nature win budget, or is there more to the story?
Well, look, some people are cautious about some of those EPBC reforms. I think you can certainly count that $500 million as a win for nature because, it's just, even if the legislation is still not perfect, it's certainly a lot better. But the thing is, it's important not to assume that because there's extra money to bed down the EPBC Act, and because, as I mentioned earlier, there was $100 million for the Saving Native Species program, that shouldn't be taken as meaning that this budget allocates a generous amount of money for on-the-ground nature protection. Because like every previous year, that definitely isn't the case. For example, the Biodiversity Council estimates that only about 0.06% of total budget spending is allocated to on-ground programs to protect nature, which is equivalent to just $1 for nature out of every $1,667 that are spent in the budget, which is not a lot of money.
No, that isn't a lot, is it, Murray? And the Biodiversity Council points out that scientists have estimated that 1% of the budget needs to be spent on nature to prevent plants and animals becoming extinct and to get rid of, some of the invasive pests that we've seen. So 1% is what, the Biodiversity Council says we need, and we've only got 0.06%.
Yeah, so a huge difference, and we certainly need a lot more money directed towards nature. Okay, so that's the nature side of things. And on the climate and energy front, I don't know what you think about it, Francisca, but to me it seemed sort of a glass half full, glass half empty situation.
Yeah, that's right, Murray. One thing to say is that this doesn't really look like the sort of budget that an ambitious co-host of international climate talks would be putting down, in the lead up to COP later this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yep.
We were sort of expecting maybe a bit more, or hoping for a bit more to send that global sort of message.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean that Australia won't be ambitious when it comes to the crunch, and the talks are on, and Australia, Turkey and Pacific Island nations are all there trying to get a deal. But in this budget, there's nothing there that seems to say, yep, we're really going to go hard to cut climate pollution, and here's some new money to prove it. So, yeah, that's a bit disappointing. And there's certainly nothing in the budget that says, we're sick of subsidising fossil fuels by billions of dollars a year, and we're going to draw a line in the sand. So, there's some big unfinished business, which this budget hasn't addressed.
Having said that, though, not too many people in the clean energy sector are complaining about the budget, are they? Or what have we seen in the clean energy sector, Murray?
Well, I would say, people have noted that there's been some significant cuts to various clean energy programs, but they're mostly cuts where those programs had failed to fire up quite as much as they were expected to do. So there's a bit of a haircut for hydrogen funding, and there's some money clawed back that the government expected to spend on buying carbon credits, that kind of thing. So generally speaking, no one is sort of too affected by the cuts, but there is one set of companies that have a crucial role to play in Australia's shift to clean energy that's definitely not happy with the budget, and that's international renewable energy companies that have major wind and solar projects in Australia, because they're going to be detrimentally affected by changes to Australia's capital gains tax regime. And they're warning that the tax changes in the budget will have serious repercussions for them and for Australia's shift to clean energy. And it will be interesting to see how things play out in Parliament when legislation to bring in those tax changes is debated.
And then 2 days after the budget was handed down by Treasurer Jim Chalmers, opposition leader Angus Taylor gave his budget speech in reply. And this is where the opposition sets out how it would do things differently. And in his speech, Angus Taylor made it very clear that if he becomes Prime Minister, Australia will go down a very different path on climate and energy. In his speech, Angus Taylor claimed that Labor's net zero obsession is driving up inflation and destroying our economy. Taylor also pledged to abolish what he called Labor's hidden carbon taxes, like the so-called safeguard mechanism. And as we know, the safeguard mechanism is one of Australia's core climate policies, affecting around 30% of our total emissions and our sort of 200 plus largest facilities, and has seen reforms over the last few years, which we will be talking about in a Track Changes podcast episode coming out in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that.
Yep.
Taylor added that the coalition government would work with coal-fired power plant owners to keep them running as long and as hard as possible to get electricity prices down. And he said that the coalition government would also rewrite Labor's EPBC reforms to speed up environmental approvals.
Yes.
What's your take on this, Murray?
Well, depressing, very, very depressing. I mean, particularly as Angus Taylor is a former energy minister, and the sort of foundations of the safeguard mechanism, I think, were actually, or the foundations of the current safeguard mechanism were actually sort of laid down in a sort of very bare bones way under his watch. And, and also the Labor government actually designed and push through the safeguard reforms with an eye to keeping the coalition on side, but it's just not prepared to come to the party at all. And perhaps the line that I find most depressing is that a coalition government would work with coal-fired power plants to keep them running as long and as hard as possible. This is kind of a line straight out of the Queensland LNP book, where they say, we're going to sweat those power plants, to the bitter end. The thing is, Queensland's coal-fired power plants are much newer than in the rest of the country. So, we're already in endgame for coal-fired power plants. So in terms of bringing down electricity prices, let alone tackling climate change, it would be a complete fail. So, yes, a bit depressing, really. Anyway.
A little bit, yeah.
That's life. let's hit the road, because Australia's Productivity Commission is currently investigating the need to reform the way heavy vehicles are regulated in Australia. And the nature of those reforms will affect the take-up of electric trucks. In a new submission to the Productivity Commission's inquiry, Tesla calls for a blanket exemption from curfews for electric trucks, so that, the curfews that currently apply to diesel trucks driving through urban areas, that it wants those removed for electric trucks. And it also urges a faster rollout of heavy charging sites. They seem like sensible recommendations, both of them. Meanwhile, the Electric Vehicle Council has some bombshell statistics on the health impacts of diesel trucks on people living in cities and towns. It says that heavy vehicle exhaust is responsible for about $6.2 billion in health costs each year and up to 2,000 avoidable deaths each year, which sounds amazing, doesn't it?
It sounds massive. 6.2 billion in health costs.
Yeah, and look, I'm not sure if they mean all road pollution, but it's certainly the submission
We'll have to look into that number. Yeah.
But certainly the health impacts of exhaust fumes are very, very significant, and they do amount to billions of dollars each year.
Queensland's Labor opposition has unsuccessfully tried to disallow a waste regulation, arguing that the LNP state government had used it to sneak through provisions that allow the shooting of flying foxes to continue. Now, the history to this is that when Labor was in government, it introduced a regulation that would have banned, from 1st of July this year, a scheme that allows fruit growers to obtain permits to kill flying foxes. And the ban would have meant all growers would have to rely on exclusion netting. But a waste and recycling regulation introduced by the LNP last year repealed the deadline for phasing out the permit regime. Labor's Shadow Environment Minister Leanne Linnard says the repeal of the ban was done in a sneaky and underhanded way without any opportunity for consultation with environment and animal welfare groups. Leanne Linnard told the Queensland Parliament that flying foxes play a critical role in pollination and seed dispersal, particularly for rainforest trees and eucalypts. But Queensland's Environment Minister Andrew Powell rejected the criticisms and said he expected the number of permits to kill flying foxes to continue on a downward trend. He also said that quotas are in place that restrict the number of flying foxes that can be killed.
The federal and Queensland governments have released a new Reef 2050 catchment water quality strategy. The new strategy includes new targets to be achieved by 2032. Now, I think there are a couple of things that raised a bit of a red flag for me in this new strategy. Firstly, it's surprisingly dismissive about the failure to meet the previous 2025 water quality targets. The other thing is that the old 2025 targets were in easy to understand percentage levels. For example, the governments were chasing a 60% reduction in nitrogen from 2009 levels and a 25% reduction in sediment. That meant that progress towards those targets was easy to understand and monitor because they were expressed in percentage terms. But the new targets are in tonnage terms, and those just aren't as relatable as percentage targets. We can't really judge progress easily. Yeah, so sorry to have a big long whinge about that. But
no worries, Murray. We love a good whinge.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's regroup again in 2032 and see whether it all panned out as planned.
Yes.
In Australia's Senate, the Greens have kicked off a committee inquiry into the growth and impact of data centres in Australia. Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young said that every day she hears from people who are concerned about the impacts of AI on our environment, water and energy supply. Senator Hanson-Young said, "We cannot allow Australia to become a dumping ground for energy-hungry data centres without proper scrutiny or public accountability or consultation, and that is what this inquiry will provide." This will be a really interesting inquiry because the Australian Energy Market Operator, which operates Australia's electricity system, has estimated that data centre electricity demand could grow at around 25% per year, which is absolutely staggering. And at that rate, it would account for 6% of total demand in the national energy market by 2030. So really big numbers, a huge impact on our footprint.
Yes.
And a lot of energy demand to be providing. So it will be interesting to see the outcomes of this.
There were some cuts to government funding to develop green hydrogen projects in the latest budget, but that doesn't mean funding for green hydrogen projects has been cut altogether. The Australian Renewable Energy Agency has just announced a shortlist of 7 projects for potential funding through round 2 of the Hydrogen Head Start program. Shortlisted applicants have to submit their full applications by early September.
Well, that's certainly exciting from a hydrogen perspective. I look forward to seeing which of these goes ahead. Now, from across the Queensland-New South Wales border, the grass is always greener. There's always lots of reasons to love New South Wales from a climate perspective. And one of the reasons we've loved New South Wales is that for many years there's been a strong level of bipartisanship support between the two major parties on clean energy and stopping climate pollution. But there are some signs that this bipartisanship might now be under a bit of pressure. The New South Wales Parliament is prepping to debate a government renewable energy bill to speed the approval of priority clean energy projects. But in the meantime, the opposition last week introduced its own bill focused on wind and solar decommissioning. The opposition's bill would enable the introduction of a financial assurance regime to ensure end-of-life rehabilitation costs can be covered. The bill would also require development consents to specify that materials in wind and solar farms are reused or recycled at the end of life. Meanwhile, a debate is yet to commence on the government's Prioritising Renewable Energy Bill, which aims to speed up the process of approving and building priority clean energy projects. In a sign that the state government is not taking opposition support for granted this time around, New South Wales Planning Minister Paul Scully's second reading speech for the government bill called out what he called confusion and division between the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals.
Yes, it'll be very interesting to see how that bill plays out in the New South Wales Parliament because, like you said, we've all been looking very fondly at New South Wales as a real role model for how other states should behave. But yet we seem to be heading to a place where bipartisanship is just less visible than ever before, which is really a bit demoralising. But anyway, let's cheer ourselves up because, there might be a few bumps in the road to getting new wind and solar farms and transmission infrastructure underway, but there's still a huge amount of progress being made. And staying with New South Wales, the state government has just awarded a contract that will help to de-risk and support AGL's construction of a new grid-scale battery. And it's awarded another contract, and this is a really interesting one. It's awarded another contract to NLX for a major demand response project. How this project works is that NLX will sign up commercial and industrial customers that will in turn receive payments for reducing their power use when the New South Wales grid is under stress. So NLX already does this, and the new contract will allow it to expand the project. And if you're wondering what impact the extra demand response capacity will have, NLX says it will provide enough capacity to support around 10,000 homes during grid emergencies. It is like having a sort of virtual battery because, while a battery can discharge when the grid is under stress, this project reduces demand in parts of the grid so that power continues to go to other parts.
And that's only the start of some big plans in New South Wales. The state government will soon be offering contracts for a massive 2.5 gigawatts of new renewable energy generation capacity. And at the same time, it will be seeking 12 gigawatt hours of new long-duration energy storage. So that's going to mean a lot more wind and solar capacity in the state and more grid-scale batteries. And pretty much all of it will be built on farmland, not on bushland, and farming will still be able to take place on sites that are hosting the wind and solar farms and batteries.
Farmers or anyone else who hosts wind or solar farms or new transmission lines get annual payments for being hosts. But it's not just hosts who get paid. Communities living in regions where clean energy infrastructure is located also receive payments. And last week, the New South Wales government announced it's making an initial $60 million available to communities in the New England Renewable Energy Zone through its Community and Employment Benefit Program. The funding is being brought forward to ensure community projects can start to be delivered well before construction starts on clean energy projects in the New England area.
There's also some fantastic renewable energy news in Victoria. The Victorian government has finished its environmental assessment of West Wind's proposed massive 1.65 gigawatts Warwick Nabil Energy Park wind farm and has concluded the project is environmentally acceptable if certain conditions are met. The decision marks a major advance towards final approval for the project, which is expected to create almost 950 construction jobs. The $2.5 billion 219 turbine wind farm will have the capacity to meet the electricity needs of up to 1.2 million homes, equivalent to about 12.5% of the state's electricity requirements. That's huge. The wind farm will be built on agricultural land within the Western Renewable Energy Zone, and farming will continue as the wind farm is being built and once it starts operating. Community benefit schemes associated with the wind farm will provide a minimum of $2,000 per turbine per year. Those payments are in addition to payments made to landholders hosting turbines and associated infrastructure.
Now, this next one is very close to my heart. I'll explain why in a second. But there's also some small-scale renewables news from Victoria. A Victorian Parliamentary Committee inquiry into renewable energy for apartments has released almost 100 submissions. And there's some really interesting ideas in there. And it's also released transcript from the inquiry's first 2 public hearings. And the reason this one appeals so much to me is that the apartment block where I live, we basically ran a voluntary opt-in program in 2022 to put solar on our shared roof that services 10 of the 18 apartments. And our next project that's underway is to replace our fossil gas shared boiler with a heat pump system. So yes, I'm going to be very interested in watching what happens at this inquiry and what recommendations it makes.
Murray, that is absolutely fantastic. What a wonderful initiative your apartment complex has been able to do together, and a great example for others. That's really inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, there's particular factors that I think made it doable here. I guess partly the size. So there was 18 apartments and this, strong friendship networks and so on. So to some extent, we were in a slightly unique position, but certainly, yes, many other apartment blocks can do the same thing.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please click on subscribe or follow. If you want to know more about what we're talking about today, sign up to receive our newsletter. You can find it at earthed.au. You can receive the newsletter for free. But if you're able to do so and want to make sure we keep going with the podcast and newsletter, please consider making a monthly contribution via our newsletter page.
That's it for today. You're all up to date. 2 more people are crucial to making this podcast happen. Sophie Sedaris and the co-founder of the Earthed News Service, Chris Dancy. See you next time.
See you next time.